The following is a conversation with John Redfern, who is the CEO of Eavor Technology, easily one of the most exciting businesses in one of the most exciting industries in the world right now. John's got an extensive resume. He's been described as an expert investor, advisor, and serial entrepreneur in the data analytics, oil service, and energy tech verticals. John has spent his career in executive roles at multiple international oil corporations as a director at Hess in London. He was the president of Accumap in Calgary and president of IHS Energy in Denver. John also spent 13 years both living and operating in China, whilst being there co-founding a series of startups. John holds a degree in engineering physics from Quaise University in Kingston, law degrees from McGill University in Montreal, and an MBA degree from INSEAD in France. Now, it might sound like wild conjecture, but if you take John at his word, and as well recent guests on the podcast, Magnus Brandberg and Patrick Hansen at theirs, the market potential for geothermal could be the most discounted opportunity in the world at the moment. And if that's not wild enough for you, geothermal might also be the answer to carbon-free energy as well. So while I'm typically over-optimistic and a dreamer, take that wild conjecture with a heavy dose of salt and we actually might fall somewhere closer to reality. In this chat with John, the first 30 minutes cover John's extensive experience doing business in China before we then move on to Eavor Technology and top to bottom, the power and potential of geothermal energy. Specifically in the podcast, you can expect to hear about what it was like doing business in China during the greatest economic rise in history, Eavor Technology, what makes them different, and then of course geothermal top to bottom, its limitations, capital raising, what it takes to dig deeper, and of course, probably the most exciting thing for me as well, what does universal adoption of this technology look like? How does it change the energy map? So, alrighty, hang around to the end for my afterthoughts as well as for me to explain my ambition for this podcast. And with absolutely no further delay, here is John Redfern. Mr. Redfern, thank you so much for sparing some of your very valuable time.
John, please. Yeah.
So, during your time at Pathminder, which is a Chinese business, you were president for 2 years between 2003 to 2005. Mm-hmm. Of the 45 staff, you were the only non-Chinese. This was in 2003, and then for the next 15 years before joining Eavor, you were either CEO, founder, chairman, or president of 4 other companies in China. And these companies ran the gamut from semiconductors, search engines, social media, and various other technical solutions.
Right.
So I want to ask you to talk to me a little bit about business in China, because from the outside, one hears so much things, that the Chinese don't innovate like the West. A lot of their popular apps are rip-offs, horrible stories like Foxconn. As well, there is this great Chinese parable that a man who rises before dawn 365 days a year will never go hungry. So they're very hard workers. Right. It's ingrained into the culture. Censorship being the factory of the world. The documentary Ascension. All of this just paints this.
My goodness, that's a long question, but a lot of topics. Let me just randomly answer some of them. Some of them are always, I find entertaining. Just to mention Foxconn right from the start, the stat that always amazed me is everyone was very upset, if you remember. I visited the Foxconn factory and it had almost 500,000 people in it when I went, that whole campus on the east side.
Try to talk a bit closer to the mic, John. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and the whole Foxconn issue, back when I was there in the early days, I was there from about 2003, we went through 1 year where everyone was up in arms about Foxconn because they had been some suicides, which is tragic. And they had, with much fanfare, put up some nets to catch people as they fell down. And everyone was going, oh my God, this terrible work environment, how can people survive? But what people didn't realize is that factory had almost 500,000 people in it. And if you actually did this stuff from a statistical point of view, you were twice as likely to commit suicide in an American university than working for Foxconn. Yes, but when you heard there was X number of people, we just aren't used to dealing with that sort of scale of operation, so it makes no sense. This is an operation that had to hire 100,000 new people every year. So when I went there and started hiring people, I got all these resumes come in and go, what, everyone worked for Foxconn? How is that possible? But everyone knew when they left the farm First thing you do, you go out and walk down to Foxconn. You got no experience. They'll give you a place to live. They'll feed you. They'll put you on the assembly line. But you don't mind because you know 6 months to a year from now, you're going to be moved on and ahead of all the other people who are following in your footsteps. But so it was an interesting time to be alive there. I ended up going there very much by mistake. Some guy who, on the part miner side, which was a component trading firm, and Shenzen was a white hot heart of the chip trading business in China. There was about 100,000 people in Shenzhen who do nothing all day but buy and sell electronic components on the phone. And so he was having a hard time getting someone to go there. Part Miner at the time, it's now defunct, but at the time it had the definitive database of all the world's electronic components, and it was a shortage trader. So that was interesting. You can see he called me up and said, I was living in California at the time, and said, John, move to Shenzhen and set up my office. And I go like, where? What? I never heard of the place in 2003. And I said, well, wait a sec. Let me get this proposition correct. You want me to move to China, a place I've never been. I don't speak the language. I don't know the industry. Shit, I'm never going to get an offer like that again. Count me in. And arrived there, and as you can imagine, everything was a bit fast and loose back in those days. Yeah, everywhere there, sort of pre-Olympics, pre-2008, was pretty open and wide. And that was sort of the pivot point when things changed. A lot of foreigners started showing up after 2008. And you ended up, there was a bit of tension around the Olympics. And it just got more restrictive after that. But at the start, one of my main attractions to China was that you could do almost anything. So we used it as a base to start up some startups. And you would just call someone anywhere in the world, and it didn't matter whether the guy was coming from India or England or the States or whatever. You told him, look, fly to Hong Kong, go to the border, look for the guy with the suit and the briefcase over on the left. He'll give you a multiple entry visa. You come in, I'll pay you in Hong Kong. No one's going to care. We have all this great infrastructure. Cost of living's low. It's semi-tropical climate and hub of innovation, where you can get any possible piece of electronics, etc., that you could ever imagine. So it was a great startup spot and very open and free. It's not the same. We didn't even have censored internet at the start. So it all evolved over time. But you can imagine the excitement of being in a town that was, well, I put it this way. I'm 20 years older than the town. And the town has 15 million people in it. And a bunch of 100-story buildings and, a subway map that looks like a plate of spaghetti. And it's just mind-boggling when you think about it all in that way. So I don't know. I'm sort of rambling a bit, but I can answer. The one other thing I would say is on the innovation side. Innovation comes in many forms, and copying is a form of innovation. But once you get good at copying, you can then start to innovate, and you can then start to innovate in a more profound level than the people who never got through the manufacturing or copying of it. I remember at the start, had a friend of mine come over from Apple, and we were looking at a bunch of the electronic phones there. You could get phones that look like anything, a pack of cigarettes, a Barbie phone, you name it. There was like thousands of different phones. And we'd be looking at these iPhones, and he's going, wait a sec, they're not even charging enough here to pay for the components or the bill of materials. And I said, you don't get it. All the components are fake too. It's like an entire fake infrastructure. And you'll notice they don't just copy them. Where else are you getting an iPhone that has, you can put multiple SIM cards in simultaneously? Key requirement of the Chinese market, but not something Apple would ever do themselves. So it was always fascinating to see how that worked. And in fact, you ended up with a term called Shenzen, which was sort of a term of sort of the fakes got so good and were so creative and so unusual that it became you'd almost want them, as part of a status symbol at one point. But, you could go down. I had friends of mine who were electronic engineers who would come from Silicon Valley or India or whatever, and they would be used to having to go to Radio Shack or whatever to get their components. And I'd take them down to Huaqian Bay, sort of the electronics market, which is a bunch of 50-story buildings filled with little tiny booths selling every possible type of electronic. And they'd always come back and I'd say, it doesn't matter, whatever you need, they have it here. And I remember I had one friend came on and he wanted a 1-watt laser pointer. I don't know if you realize how powerful that is, but most of them are like 5 milliwatts. And we went around and all these guys claimed they had it. And then finally, we got a guy who got it. He said, oh, you want a 1-watt laser? He took one out and lit a cigarette with it. Right? Wow. And he said, that's the one, but it was crazy times.
Give us an example of almost anything. You said you could do almost anything.
Well, I mean, you don't have a lot of oversight. You don't have, put it this way, one of the things you could do is if you run into a border guard or a police officer in North America, you know that they're good guys and everything else, but you don't give them any lip. You don't, argue with them, if you think you're right? But in China, you definitely argue with the border guard or the policeman if you think you're right. And you go like, what are you talking about? And these guys, they'll give them absolute shit and you'll end up having a discussion and you won't end up being, So again, that was one that always struck me as unusual when we always think of China as this totalitarian regime where it's a police state, and there are problems in certain spots, but the general reality is the local policeman is a young skinny kid on a bike. He's not intimidating, right? And the amount of policing going on in a place like Shenzhen, they had about 1/3 the number of policemen that Hong Kong did. So China was one of those things where on paper, technically things were quite buttoned down, but no one was very good at following the rules. And every once in a while they'd try to, let's say, tighten up a rule to get rid of counterfeit DVDs, but you knew 2 weeks later you go back and they'd all be there. Right? Okay, we tried, but so it was this whole chaotic freedom of the place. And in reality, it shouldn't have been that surprising because as we all know, Chinese people like business, they like doing their own thing. The joke used to be the only place you could find poor Chinese people in the world was in China, which was not the Chinese person's fault. It was, the government at the time was not enabling them to blossom in the way they should have.
But they had a tough late 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is when I was there, you talked about me being the only foreigner in some of the startups I was running there, but I was also the only guy, over 30, or in a lot of cases over 25.
No way.
Yeah, because anyone my age, it was very few exceptions, was pretty well useless. Because they would have had their formative years in the Cultural Revolution and stuff like that. There was no employment experience to be gained. So people my age tended to be brought in by their kids or grandkids and stayed at home and looked after their grandkids, right? And that's about it. So, and then eventually what was interesting is I'd been there long enough that a lot of the younger guys I had hired for peanuts at the start, 10 years later would be meeting me for lunch and saying, oh, how'd you like my Maserati? And stuff like that. And I go like, what the hell? What's going on here? There was a lot of money made by a lot of people. And so it was one of those once in history opportunities that happens in every country. When the big transition from the farm to city happens, it creates this humongous conveyor belt. Yeah. That just
and you happen
transports.
To be there. During that transition in the most populous country the world's ever known.
Right. You're talking about hundreds of millions of people making that transition. And that's a pretty cool thing to see.
You must have created the most unreal network. For example, if you wanted to, for instance, I'm sure you've explored it, but if there's any geothermal applications for Eavor in China, I mean, I'm
sure it'll be interesting. I don't want to compete with them right away because you have to be ready for that, and
because you'll be copied.
Well, because they're fearsome competitors, let's say. But geothermal, especially for heating purposes, has been growing quite rapidly in China, and we're going to have the World Geothermal Congress in China next year. So certainly that'll be pretty good timing for us. So we'll go back at that time.
Oh, I got to go there.
Yeah, I haven't gone back the last 2 years because of pandemic, but yeah, definitely we'll be back for that, and it'd be interesting to see what's happening on that side of things. But again, it's a whole bunch of different countries. Going to Beijing is completely different than going to Shenzhen.
Really? Even still today?
Oh yeah. I mean, Shenzhen, what's the old saying? The mountains are high and the emperor is far away. So it was always a little more free and easy. And that's one of the things a lot of people don't realize, how there's really lots of regional power barons. It's just the guys running the local state government don't always listen as closely as you expect to the federal the guys in Beijing. Just think of those squabbling policemen arguing with you. Same thing higher up. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's changed a lot under the current guy, under Xi. But certainly in the past, when I was there in a freer time, right now it's a bit miserable with the pandemic, of course.
Sure, it looks
locked
that way.
down. Yeah.
If I could just comment on what you said earlier in response to an example of doing almost anything. It does just sound like classic developing world corruption. So can you differentiate from it? Say, for example, in Mexico, if you know a guy, you can call a guy, you can grease a palm, and you can all of a sudden have access to a big market that in America, in Sweden, in Australia, it would take you years of legislation to get into.
The good thing you got to remember in China, it's not like a petrostate. It's not something that has a bunch of wealth that people are just trying to divide up. All the wealth they had to create. So they have to have competitive businesses. They got to have stuff like that rewarded properly. And I think in China as well too, the trauma they went through in the 20th century left everyone with a very, a sense of wanting to do something big as well as get rich, right? That there was something they wanted to improve China and get rich. The classic story is the one of the, I won't say, I shouldn't really say, but some third world diplomat coming and visiting his Chinese equivalent, and the Chinese guy has this humongous house. It's beautiful, and the guy goes, "Man, how do you do this on a civil servant salary of whatever it was, $200 a month?" And the guy says, "Oh, you see that bridge in the bay?" He said, "Oh yeah, 50% of that was mine, or 10% of that was mine." The guy goes, "Oh wow." Then he switched roles. A year later, the Chinese guy is visiting his other third world, diplomat, and the guy says, "An even bigger house." And he goes, "Wait a sec, you got to explain this one to me." And the guy goes, "See that bridge in the bay?" The guy goes, "No." "Exactly. It was all mine." So, it was not, there was a lot of tipping, let's say, a lot of incentives going back and forth, but they tended to be functional ones. It'd be 2% on this or 2% on that. I used to laugh that in China, you would never tip on the stuff we did over here. Like, for example, you'd never tip on a restaurant bill or tip the taxi driver. Certainly not when I first got there. But you would tip on the contract or something. All these things that you'd be, are just patently illegal back in the States and everything else. So that was, to be honest, that was one of my challenges, because the original company I was with was an American-owned company. I was a foreigner, so obviously I couldn't do any of that, right? So I set the company up and got it going, and in the other startups I did, to the most extent, it was more as a back office. The last one, I guess, we were selling locally, but mostly to international companies. I, would keep my nose clean and not be doing any of that. But it also meant that what was best for the company is, in a pretty short order, once it was set up and running, if it was selling into the Chinese market, it's better a Chinese guy did that, and ran that. Otherwise, you're in an impossible situation trying to bridge two cultures and satisfy both in an impossible way.
So you were there for 17 years, 2003.
13 actually.
13 years, forgive me.
Yeah.
Have done several interviews on this podcast about special economic zones.
Yeah.
And I know that they played an absolutely fundamental role in transitioning China into a market economy, especially with the rest of the world. I wonder how much you interacted with them and whether you have any sort of anecdote about needing to interact with them.
Well, I mean, Shenzhen was the original special economic zone. And it was a bit of a walled garden at the start. When I first moved there, you still needed your passport, whether you're, or identity card, whether you're Chinese or foreigner, to get in and out of Shenzhen. And not every Chinese person could get in. So there's sort of like an internal border. By the time I left, a lot of that distinction had gone away, and it was pretty well free movement everywhere. But at the start, I think it was just more a form of control, where they could control a bit the speed with which people moved into the city. And I think, to be fair to them, part of the reason you want to do that, so you don't end up with urban squalor or shanty towns or anything else. Shenzhen apartments originally were pretty small, I believe, before I got there. But you never got, things that you'd count as a shanty town. They got to build, they got to control it so that too many people didn't come in immediately, so to speak.
Yeah. For the audience, and actually for me as well, can you put Shenzhen on the map?
Just across the border from Hong Kong.
Yeah, okay. So that's a crazy populated part of the world, isn't it? Because isn't Shuangshu just a little bit south of that as well?
You have the Pearl River Delta, which is a huge thing. So you have Hong Kong, then as you go inland, you have Shenzhen. Then you have, I always love this, Dongguan and Guangdong, the town of Dongguan in the state of Guangdong, which also is about 10 million people. And then you get up to Guangzhou, aka Canton, and that's at the peak of it. And then you go down the other side, Foshan, right down to Macau. And you add up the population, that's 60 or 70 million people. Yeah, that's 60 or 70 million people in that one little area. There's not a lot of
which is equivalent to, I don't know, the size of Maine or something.
Yeah, it's a fair size.
Yeah.
But anyways, it was crazy to see all that. Crazy to see all the subways built. Crazy to see all the high-speed rail links appear from nowhere. It's very crazy to see the things like the airports they built appear out of nowhere. Kilometers long.
I find it so romantic, this idea of, like you said earlier very well, it happens once in a country's lifetime. But you were there for the transition, A former guest on the podcast was a guy called Jeff Raby, who's a diplomat, an Australian diplomat, who was in Beijing.
Right.
But he was an economist there at the same time as you in the early 2000s. And he just says it was like it was a romantic old little... It was just a romantic time because people were still riding around on bikes. You had this great expat community. Everything you did had just boundless opportunity.
Everyone was, unbelievably optimistic. I remember being in that same situation in Moscow when it happened to the Soviet Union, but that didn't last very long. China had lasted.
Wow, so you were there too.
China had
Getting
lasted.
Around, John.
China had lasted pretty well, and it's your one chance to, really be a visible minority. You walk around for several weeks and then you see this one funny looking guy walking down the road and you realize, oh, wait a sec, he's funny looking because he looks like me. But you forget everything else. It's such a ethnic block of Han Chinese. I remember get people come and visit me, and after a couple of weeks they'd come up to me and get a little worried and they go, John, no one even looks Chinese anymore. It's the fat guy, the tall guy, the blonde guy, not blonde, but the bald guy, And it's once the ambient temperature is Chinese, no one looks Chinese. It's just strange how that works.
You sort of snubbed the idea earlier that the Chinese couldn't innovate. Can you give some examples of Chinese innovation?
Well, I'll give. Well, how about they were the leaders in drone manufacture. They have certainly were cutting edge in social media. If you've used any of the Tencent products like WeChat,
No,
but
I stay away from it.
a better
TikTok.
yeah, yeah. That's like crack, social media
Yeah.
crack. But and the Chinese did that. So, but I think a better way of looking at it is that when I moved there, China's production of international patents was like zero. More recently, they're up there with the U.S. sort of co-leading the amount of patents, international patents per year that are issued. And what's mind-boggling is about last time I looked at the statistics, about half of those were from Shenzhen, a town without even a decent research university. And so there's all, it's not being published, it's not public university stuff, but there you've got, Shenzhen, I think personally, generating more patents than any other town on the planet, probably by a long shot. That that is phenomenal.
So you've hinted a little bit about it changed over the time you were there, and certainly
Yeah.
now it would be quite different. Can you give some personal anecdotes to describe how the change happened? Because it
Uh,
sounds like if last year Shenzhen produced more international patents than any other city in the world, I mean, they're doing something right. But then there is clearly this very authoritarian undertone that is
yeah,
coming out of China.
that's coming back from one individual is leading that. But I think to stay too much out of the politics, the real transition I saw was, like I say, from 2003 to 2005 in a place like Shenzhen. I arrived just after SARS went away, right? So there weren't a lot of foreigners. You felt very unique. When my kids came and visited, they loved it because they were rock stars. Everyone would want their picture taken with them, type of thing. Like, wow, foreign kids. That's what a concept. But then starting 2008, the West sort of went into recession. There was the Beijing Olympics. And I'd go down to my local Starbucks, and all of a sudden, they were all filled with foreigners. They just sort of, it's like everyone sat down and say, well, nothing's happening here. China looks interesting. And they all just got on the plane and showed up. And that sort of changed it a bit.
It was about the wealth creation, wasn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
people just saw gold on the streets.
Right. They saw potential for gold at a time when there wasn't a lot of gold in the West. The 2008, 2009 recession was a bit scary for a lot of people. A lot of people got wiped out. And yeah, China looked like the brave new world. And the rest of it has happened. That was a very noticeable shift. But since that time, it's been a more gradual change. But then it's in a universe right now, the post-pandemic, that I have no experience with because I haven't been there for 2 years. But it sounds like it's completely changed again. Like a lot of places, probably not for the better. But it's very.
Can you speak to that at all? I mean, I assume that's coming from conversations with old friends and stuff.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on it, but I just know it shut down a lot of stuff. My last business there finally got shut down. We were doing a store location planning business where we mapped every store in China and mapped every shopping mall and all that. But all our clients were the foreign, multinational retailers, the McDonald's and Nikes of the world. Where do you put your next 10,000 stores? That all came grinding to a halt, obviously, once the pandemic happened. But there's lots of businesses like that. But the main thing is it's just hard to get in and out with the pandemic, or it has been. And even if you're in, who wants a lockdown? I mean, that's no thank you. So what about geothermal? Maybe we should talk a little.
Yes, no, John.
But
We will.
You got any other questions? Sure, I have no problem.
Forgive me. I do want to ask you two quick ones on China, but they're less sort of, broad commentary. It's just a quick from your experience. So, what's a practice in China that you wish you could write into the Western business culture?
I mean, at the time, it's just the entrepreneurial nature of it, there was no, and it was all driven by optimism. People believed anything was possible, which of course is essential if you're going to be an entrepreneur. Whereas too often in the West, it all gets ground down, and you can't do that, you can't try that. There you had sort of bold experimentation. The guy would be, you'd run into a guy who had a shoe factory. And he said, "Oh, I'm tired of shoes. I'm going to make TVs now." And you go like, "What the hell? You can't just decide that." "Oh yeah, no, it's simple. Just different components." And you'd get sort of conversations like that, and you go, "Man, I just wasn't thinking." Or the whole fact that, so often in the West we're thinking, "Oh, there's been so much change. It's how can we possibly adapt that quickly?" And then you'll go and meet people in China who've been through way more change. I'd be interviewing someone who'd be speaking English to me, but you'd see they'd sort of be looking around at you, trying to triangulate my nose or something. A big nose is considered something great in China, by the way. But, and I'd say, why are you looking like that? He said, "Well, I've never actually spoken to a non-Chinese person before." And your sort of head just sort of blows up, and you go, "Well, what, you're speaking English and you'd never, because it's just that big block." Or the other takeaway that I found just charming, I hired this one guy, be a representative in Shanghai. And he was going, "John," one of the first things he asked, he said, "John, how many countries have you been to?" And I said, "Oh, that's a good question. Let me think about it." He said, wait, you have to think about it? "I've been to one. How can you have to think about it? How can there possibly be so many?" And so there's just this whole, disconnect that was always throwing up amusing insights, and we just took for advantage.
You get this impression though, because I've only been to the country once, and it was by accident. I took the cheapest flight possible between Europe and Australia, and we had a domestic layover in China, and visa problems happened. The whole plane, it was full of Dutch people. The whole plane was not allowed on. We had this whole thing. We were there for a while, and the point was made to me that a lot of the people we were interacting with potentially had never even read an English word in their life. Not only had they never heard it spoken, and it just makes me think, this man you're speaking to who's making a big deal out about you've been to so many countries, how much international wanderlust is there in a culture that has its internet censored, and I'm trying to avoid just leaning into sort of stereotypical takes on China, but
yeah,
you know what
I mean, again, anyone who's interested will have a VPN anyways, and even during the internet censorship area, we are still able in Shenzhen to openly buy a direct link into Hong Kong for our business purposes. So there, people always went around, and the fact that the internet would be censored actually increases the interest in traveling, to actually see things, right? I mean, one of the people don't want a censored view. One of the things, for example, people don't realize is they say, "Well, why were all the Chinese always buying those bootleg, CDs? Was it because they were cheap?" No. They don't mind going to the theater and paying more than you or I was to sit in big lazy boy chairs. They got all the bootleg ones because they wanted the non-censored version, right? That was the big attraction. So, guys like the guy who I just told you about, Whaley, he's traveled to a whole bunch of countries now. Almost all my Chinese friends, they've all done a ton of travel. That was one of the first things they all wanted. And they still like it. And they still, as much as possible, to the extent it's legal, love the idea of getting a beachhead outside of China just in case. Right, so I think if anything, all the changes right now, I'm guessing for the right people, it's probably made the attraction of travel even greater. Yeah, and if you go to Paris, you'll see what I mean. The number of Chinese people there.
Okay, and now one more quick one, John, which you'll be able to knock off quickly. A Chinese business practice. The other way around. A Western business practice that needs to be written into the Chinese DNA.
Western practice that's Chinese. Well, I mean, it would, all those cliches about, not just China, but Japan and everyone else liking very loosey-goosey, broad agreements that are impossible to enforce. I think that one, it's just be nice to have a better middle ground. Not the U.S. version where unless it says it in the contract, it doesn't exist, and not the Chinese version of saying, well, let's just have this sort of general principles, and then we'll worry about the actual implementing of it later. That would be a nice middle ground to get, and I'm sure we'll get there eventually as things continue to internationalize. Even so, they tend to seem to be going in reverse at the moment. I think history is hard to turn around, even if people try for short periods of time.
Nice. Well, John, look, it's just I've never spoken to someone before with so much tangible experience operating in China, and I really wanted to get a sense for what you thought about it. But let's talk about an extremely exciting company.
The future, man. The future.
Yes. So why the transition into energy?
Well, energy-wise, I've worked for oil companies like Hess in the UK and in Canada, so I did have that oil company background. I also did work for service companies, used to run IHS Energy, which has now been merged with Market and then Dow Jones or whatever, so been on the service company side. But yeah, when I was in China, obviously you're not an oil and gas entrepreneur because that's one of those pillars that's owned by the states and by the state itself, and you don't, as an individual, you can't play there. So yeah, while I was in China, we got more onto the techie side, the data side, things like that. In fact, anyways, we'll leave that. But this whole thing came out, this whole Eavor thing came about because there's a bunch of people I tend to innovate with, and one of them was this guy named Paul Cairns in Alberta. And Paul was the one who was looking for an idea. We were sitting there back in 2014, 2015, 2016 were terrible years for the oil industry, especially in Canada, because you had the low prices, but then you had the lack of pipelines, no offtake. It was desperate. And at the same time, there was this $80 billion unfunded orphan well liability that someone had to pay, and it looked like the public purse was going to have to pick it up, and they're going to pay $80 billion to turn a bunch of old oil well sites into little patches of grass, which seemed to be not a great use of funds. So this whole thing started by Paul sitting there and brainstorming with me and saying, God, there's got to be something better we can do with all those oil and gas sites. And like about 1,000 other people, we all came up with the same idea to say, geez, it'd be great if we could turn those old wells, those old assets back into geothermal wells and produce something from them. There were already brownfield sites. Why not? And we looked into that, and unfortunately for all the people still following that business model, we could tell it was never going to scale. It was never going to, and the key is the energy industry. Unless you have something that scales massively, you're not part of the solution, right? You're a niche product. And reusing oil wells was always going to be that. It's going to be a little bit here, a little bit there. You're never going to add gigawatts of power where you need it, when you need it. So we sort of gave up on that. But Paul kept thinking about it. And one of the things we had noticed as to why geothermal wouldn't work in a place like Alberta, in general, whether you used an old oil well or not, was because the temperatures were so low that you ended up, to produce the power, you got to pump water in and out of the aquifer, the reservoir that you find at the bottom of the well.
The rock temperature.
Yeah, the rock temperature in Alberta is not very high. The temperature gradient isn't very high. Typically around the world, the temperature gradient is about 30 degrees C per kilometer. If you're in a good place for traditional geothermal, you want it maybe to be 60, maybe double that, 60 degrees C per kilometer. And so, in fact, you take a big country like Canada, geothermal is so niche that there has never been a single kilowatt of geothermal power produced anywhere in Canada, which is incredible when you think about it. It's all in a few places like Iceland, like Kenya, like the geysers in California. But in general, part of the problem with geothermal is you got to produce a lot of fluid, a lot of hot brine from a reservoir and then re-inject it back into that same reservoir. That takes a lot of power. It's got about a 50% parasitic pump load. So you produce 2 megawatts just to have net 1 megawatt type of thing. So what Paul said, he said, geez, instead of pumping the water in and out of the aquifer, what if we just took a couple of oil wells, drilled down, turned towards each other, connected them, made a big U-loop, tied it back on the surface with a pipeline? Couldn't you flow the water a lot easier? And we actually looked at that and said, that seems terribly expensive, Paul. But you know what? It's better than you think, because not only do you not have to pump it, it pumps itself. Once it starts moving, you have hotter water on this side, and that's lighter density, so that'll rise. It's cooler water on the other side, so that's something, so you end up with this thermosiphon effect. We say, hey, it pumps itself. And it was that first, it's still totally uneconomic, but it was that first eureka moment that got us sort of interested in saying, what could we do if we took all the learnings we had from the shale revolution and the oil sands and all the experience they have there drilling multilateral wells and doing thermodynamic subsurface and driving down drilling costs? Is there something here? And at that point we said, like any good entrepreneur, okay, our gut says yes. I have no idea how it's going to work out, but our gut says yes. Let's spend, the next 5 years, if it keeps working, doing everything we need to do, every possible innovation to make this idea of the closed loop work. And that's how we got started. Now, of course, once we started doing it, of course, then we realized that, there was a lot of people, especially experts in the geothermal field, who said, no, that'll never work. Geothermal is hard enough. Closed loop geothermal is impossible. You guys are a bunch of quacks. And the last 5 years has been, we used to joke, the fact that people thought we were crazy was our original barrier to entry. Now that we've slowly convinced one group after another, and one individual, one company after another, including some big ones like some oil companies and that can actually evaluate, our learning curve ideas. Now we've got to start running, because now other people are chasing us. But essentially, it's that 5-year initial head start, just going through and every aspect of it, the design of the well, how we complete them, how we drill them, what we put in the fluid, and all that. And there was another eureka moment where after we had started and people were giving us a hard time, there's a guy, and you'll love this, who worked for Shell. On his business card, it actually said Black Swan Detector. So this guy... well, you know what that means.
Well, like he can predict the Taleb's black swan.
Yeah, exactly. Where he's to look out for potential black swans, things that are outside their current defined remit. And geothermal was one of those.
Amazing job title and job to have. Because you can just seek those.
He also pointed out that BSD also could stand for bullshit detector, but we'll leave that. But
that's very Taleb as well. The BS detector.
Yeah, but the whole thing was that we went and talked to this guy, and he said, "Look, I'll save you time. I've actually compiled a list," he said, "of the 10 reasons geothermal will never scale, and if it doesn't scale, it's in no one's interest, not even the oil companies, not even given that they have all these skill sets they can apply there." And we went and looked at this list. And we had already solved all 10 of them just by our original premise of moving into a closed loop. And I can give you that list if you want. I got it here somewhere. But it was
that would be really cool.
That was the second eureka moment. We said, okay, we're really onto something now. And then we started raising money, hiring people who actually knew something. And it's just been ongoing that. The farther you go, the more wrinkles you uncover. It all ended up being way harder than we originally expected, but that's pretty normal in startups. But that's actually a good thing, because my original fear was we were going to be able to do this, but that anyone would then be able to replicate it, which means we don't make any big return on it. But now, knowing what I know no one's going to replicate it, not without all the patents and the know-how and the exclusive arrangements and the land holdings and everything else that we put together to try to capture and ring fence this particular type of energy. And
I can only imagine how exciting that must feel to
Oh, yeah.
pay for that.
It is. And so, we started raising money and getting alliances based on that. But it's interesting when you think of the number of different ways this particular energy source is incredible. The obvious one at the start was that it's firm and not, intermittent like wind and solar. Wind and solar will always be the cheapest power around, but you get them when they come. You don't get to direct it. Our thing was firm, being geothermal, but then when we found out later it was actually dispatchable. It was inherent in the design, and we didn't even realize it at the start. It's also...
What do you mean by that, dispatchable?
What I mean is, sorry about that, still getting over COVID, but what I mean by that is when you have something like a nuclear plant or something, it's going to be firm. It produces the same amount every day, and you can't really turn it up and down easily without having a lot of complications. But what do you need right now? Right now you need a dispatchable source because you got all this wind and solar going on and off depending on when the wind's blowing, when the sun's out, and everything else. And ours, just by loosening up or choking back on that thermosiphon effect, we can change the circulation rate of the water, and we can use what we have almost like a big battery. So if our thing is 10 megawatts capacity, that's 240 megawatt hours per day. We can either produce that as a firm base load at 10 megawatts every hour, or we could, let's say, pair it with solar, shut down the power output completely at midday when you got too much solar, and then open it up and produce twice as much, let's say, in the evening when you really need it and the sun goes down and you need, intermittent power after dark, so to speak. And that's super valuable. And who else does that? There's no, you can have a gas peaker plant to do that, but there's no other green solution that does that. So we do that. One of the other big things with wind and solar is simply it requires a big footprint. So if you're going to take the current electric grid, double or triple it to take care of all the electric vehicles and all the electrification that you want to do, and then try to do that all 100% in wind and solar plus a ton of batteries, you need a lot of land. And maybe that even works in the States, because what else are you going to do with Nevada anyways, right? Except cover it with solar panels. But for most other places
outback
in the world,
Australia,
Western Australia is another example. But if you're in Europe or something, you don't want to cover half of Europe in that sort of stuff. And in places like Singapore, let's say, you're already, precluded from doing much wind and solar. They do a little bit of solar, but it's, a fraction of what they need overall. So, for us to come to those guys and say, hey, Singapore, you want to be green and you want to be independent, and you're currently, relying on 95% of your energy from imported LNG, hydrocarbons, is that really what you want? And we show them that they could be energy independent. That's pretty impressive. Or you go to Europe and say, hey, not only do you not want to cover your beautiful countryside with solar panels and windmills, but you don't really want to be reliant on Russian gas anymore. Russian gas for district heating, or Russian gas for peaker plants to make the whole thing go around. So from the whole energy security side, use of space sort of side, just dispatchability side, you name it, we're this sort of unique fix. And I know it's a unique fix because what's one of the only other alternatives that they're even discussing that could make the same impact? If all you're interested in is decarbonization, nuclear is probably your ticket, right? But why would you do nuclear if what we have is there and works? The very fact that people are even reconsidering nuclear shows they got no other options. It's just because politically it's a disaster, right?
Doesn't nuclear have a higher density than
nuclear has a
geothermal at the depth we have now could produce? Yeah,
it's definitely got a higher density than most things, but we're still way denser than we're 35 times more denser than solar, 300 times more dense than wind. We're dense enough that we can replace, and we're looking at lots of places where they're taking out things like coal plants, which are also very dense, and replacing them with our stuff. And our surface footprint is
proximity to the grid, so it can be immediately consumed.
Right. That's why that's a good location. You just fill in what's missing. So yeah, nuclear is somewhat more dense, but what we're doing is dense enough, especially when you're looking at just the surface footprint. Most of what we do is underground, so you don't even see it, and you can stack them up, just like slices of toast underground, and get pretty high density.
So it's such a crazy coincidence, but today I was at Uppsala University, an hour outside of Stockholm. They're having this thing called Energy Week.
Okay.
And I went today to sit in on the one niche sidebar geothermal chat that they were having.
Okay.
And the woman who gave the keynote speech was the head of the British Geological Survey, I think. That was her title. But on that point just there on the type of land that you would actually occupy, she said that for the equivalent geothermal energy that is being produced by a well in Southampton, you would require 20,000 acres of solar panels. And that's such a great way to think about with Eavor Technology any other, well, not any other, but some other geothermal applications, how effective they can be at powering a city. Because in your, just in Central Park, put up a nice little barrier, set up your technology, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got clean, green, reliable energy at the cost of, a mausoleum.
And what she probably didn't emphasize in Southampton, the geology is not that hot. So, if you had a hot area, it would even be higher density.
Yeah.
The other thing of doing it, she's talking about electricity. Of course, geothermal is 10 times more efficient at providing direct heat than electricity, just because the conversion ratio at the temperatures we're dealing with is not very efficient. So if you think that there's a good trade-off, footprint-wise on the electricity side, on the heat side, it's even better.
I think Sweden, I could be wrong, but I think Sweden has the largest application of that super shallow geothermal application to heat housing and to heat buildings.
Yeah, all over Scandinavia and Northern Europe, there's lots of people for, you have individual houses or even large individual buildings. You can install geothermal heat pumps. It's funny. Out in
Tabby and Dunderrid, which are the really rich suburbs, everyone's got their own little geothermal setup to heat their house.
They like the independence. Now, you still need to be powered by the grid or something that provides the electricity to run the heat pump. But it's a lot more efficient. It's a little bit different than what we're doing. It is direct conduction-based like ours, but it's very shallow. And what you're essentially doing is using the near subsurface as a heat sink just to operate your heat pump off. So, it's good. It helps the load in the summer when you're trying to keep it cool and vice versa. But it's still a little bit different than the sort of thing we're doing, where you'd put in an Everloop and it'd heat or cool the whole town, or produce its own power based on bringing up some reasonably higher temperatures.
So we're addressing what the Everloop does, I think, at the periphery. Could you explain what the product is today, and then compare it to what the initial, plans were in 2014?
Well, where it is today is we've got just one functioning prototype in our field demonstration, I should call it, in Alberta, which we built back in 2019. And that was there not to produce power, but really to prove up technically the concept. So we went to all our potential clients at that time and say, what do you still need proof on? One of the things they didn't need proof on was that we could take an ORC system and convert heat into power. That's an off-the-shelf component. But they did want to make sure we could do the well intersection reliably and repeatedly. They did want to see that we could go and drill all the multilaterals open hole and seal them with a rock pipe product instead of putting casing in, because that cuts the cost about 50% right there. But mainly they wanted us to show that we could build these things on time, on budget, and that the thermodynamic modeling we were doing would actually work. At the start, there was a big fear that, wouldn't that cool off too quickly and it won't really work and we don't believe it. So, what's ironic, of course, is one of the big advantages of what we're doing is it is predictable and you can forecast it and it is stable. So anyways, we did that, and before we built it, we estimated what the power output was going to be within a couple of percentage points, and it continues to perform in that tight range since then. And that's one of the reasons it's scalable and financeable and everything else, because it's predictable. Just like wind and solar. Wind and solar are super unpredictable on the day, but over the first 10 years of life, it all averages out. You know exactly what it's going to produce, which is very different than traditional geothermal or oil and gas, where you have all this reservoir risk. Even once it's up and running, you don't know when there's going to be some cold water breakthrough or the whole plant is going to start going into decline. So we've got that one demo plant that's costs about 13 million, but it's sort of like 2.5 kilometers by 2.5 kilometers. What we have now is we've been working on a whole portfolio of other prospects. I think we got about 70
much
of them.
deeper, right? You're looking at.
Yeah, we have much deeper. We got about 70 of them in Germany alone. We've got our first commercial project going to happen in Bavaria, on the site of a former failed traditional geothermal plant, which always is fun because all the infrastructure is there, the data is there, and it sort of proves that we can go places other people can't. But that'll be not 2.5 kilometers down, about 4.5 kilometers down, with many more multilaterals, and that'll be a power and combined power and heat project. And then, but the one we're actually going to drill first, that'll start in the fall. But the one we're going to be drilling in the summer is moving past our 1.0 technology we demoed in Alberta. We then got to take that same thing and show how we can do it deeper and hotter. So we'll be drilling probably down to about 7 kilometers this August and September in New Mexico. And the bottom of that well, which would be the deepest onshore commercial well ever drilled at 7 kilometers, should get us down to places that are where the rock temperature is 350 to 400 degrees C. So if we can do that, we're proving a system that allows us to use all our other technology, but in those hot temperatures by keeping it cool, but also by keeping that the drill bit cool and the bottom hole assembly cool. We also are planning on inducing something that's called shock cooling. So if you've got the drilling mud coming down, a special setup that we've got basically, so it arrives at the rock face, let's say 200 degrees C less than the rock temperature, it sets up all these little microfractures that end up making it easy to drill. And so if this all works the way we'd like it to work, the deeper we get
the
and
energy landscape.
The deeper we get and the hotter it gets, the faster we should drill, which is mind-boggling. You go to talk to some guy, I don't know if you've been Vinod Khosla, but he's always had a little bit of an interest in geothermal. He's a famous VC in the Valley. And his thing, he'd always say, John, the thing you want is if you can prove linear costs, you've won. Because the energy content of the heat goes up almost exponentially as it gets hotter and hotter. But if your drilling costs only go up linearly, you win. You just go deep enough and you've got economics.
Absolutely.
Well, what we've got is something that's the opposite. It actually gets faster the deeper and hotter you go, if it works out the way we say it is. So that'll be an exciting project.
I mean, that in itself sounds like the innovation. I mean, where is your innovation coming from? Because aren't a lot of really smart geophysicists and former oil and gas people working on these hard engineering problems? How is Eavor the ones who happen to have the right talent?
First of all oil and gas technology sort of tops out at about 150 to 175 degrees C. Why? Because if it's much hotter than that, you've probably baked all the hydrocarbons out of existence. They've broken down or whatever. So, all the oil and gas technology, and we're reusing a lot of it, but, a large part of it there hasn't been a lot of incentive, let's say, for the oil industry to find out how to operate at 400 degrees C, because they weren't in geothermal, and you don't need it for oil and gas. But as to the question of where our innovation comes from, we've just been very lucky that we've started to mine a very rich, sort of vein of innovation. So again, it all started with that, hey, let's make it closed loop, and it pumps itself. Well, that has just led to a whole series of other questions that have led to
with
other
the same
innovations.
The same labor is coming up with these innovations?
The same people. I mean, I think about 15 of our 45 people have all found their names onto a patent, so it's pretty broad-based in the company. Some people contribute a lot more than others, and we got some pretty smart cookies. But it's more than having smart people. It's got to be in a position where you're lucky enough that you're asking the right questions. Like, for example, the solution that we're using to be able to do this shock cooling wouldn't work in a traditional setup. You know, we're doing it by cooling the mud and keeping it cool through a way I won't tell you right now, but the patent, is coming public soon. But if I was a traditional one and I was just pumping mud down into permeable aquifers and the mud itself could dissipate from the well and go into the reservoir, it wouldn't be able to keep the drill bit cool. So it's just, there's dozens of situations like that where you say, well, how do we solve this problem? We take another little step forward and then we realize, man, the reason we figured that out is because it wouldn't have been valuable to anyone else, right? Or they don't need it, or it doesn't fit in their operating paradigm. So because we are the first one to tackle a lot of these problems with closed loop geothermal, because we're the only one to spend 5 years and intensively research it, we're by default the ones who are coming up with all these solutions. There's all this co-invention theory, right? Two people came up with a theory of evolution at the same time because it was in the air, so it's just a question of who's looking at it first or slightly ahead of the curve.
That's such a fascinating question to think about.
Yeah.
Well, why was that a few people happened to come up with the theory of evolution at the same time?
Because all the precursors were there. All the precursors were there. Uniformitarianism and the geological side that reformulated the sort of time scales you're talking about that allowed these slow processes to happen. There's just a whole bunch of stuff, and it's not like there's this and then all of a sudden you're over here. There's a whole bunch of little innovations that make it, and by the end, when the eureka moment comes, it's obvious to everyone. It's like the end of a good mystery movie. Oh yeah, of course it was the butler. Oh, why didn't I think that?
Can you think of any other great innovations that maybe have that co-innovation, like you just said? I mean, maybe electricity. I mean, Tesla and the other.
Yeah, they all
they're working at the same time.
Yeah, work on the same time. But I'm trying to think of one that would be
the car.
The car, or you look at electric cars right now, right?
I'm projecting onto your Canadian accent.
Yeah,
the car.
The car, out and about. No, I can't really. Nothing really strikes me at the time.
But there must be. I'm sorry. That's such a tangent, but that's something I've never thought about, which is fascinating. And you think so? You think that potentially that moment is happening in very deep drilling at the moment? Yeah.
A closed loop geothermal, anyways, because it's more than just being able to drill deeply and all that. But there's other. All I can say is I can't tell you all of them, but there's about 6 or 7 different innovations. When I've asked the guys the same thing, I go, that's, incredibly obvious. Now that you explained it to me, why did no one else do it? And then they'll explain, yes, but no one else would have seen value in it because of this, or no one else would have made that leap because they don't care about things at temperature, or, there's been a bunch of that, and there's always a bit of an explanation afterward as to why no one else came up with it again. But you can look at something like modern day Tesla, the electric car. What is driving that? And you could say that there's lots of people following him because the real innovation was the battery technology,
innovation,
and stuff like that. Yeah. And you couple that with all the self-driving stuff, which again was in the air. It's just taking the elements that are already there and seeing where they can be applied. But the evolution is the famous one. I mean, Darwin only published it because when he realized someone else was about to publish something, he had written.
Yeah, wasn't there some poor Russian fella who no one's ever heard of who basically came to the same conclusion?
Well, no, I think the guy's name was Wallace. I think he was another British guy.
Yeah. Damn it. Yeah. Even worse.
Yeah, but I think you're thinking of genetics. Modern genetics was. Again, some monk
Oh, really? No, I think it was. I think it was competing theory of evolution. It was
Okay,
in,
I think the guy's name was Wallace.
it was in the biography of von Humboldt. They spoke about it a lot because
Yeah.
that guy was very
Yeah.
cool. But I've now lost the question, the follow-up that I really wanted to ask you.
Oh.
So I'm going to defer to my notes. And if it
Okay.
comes back to me, forgive me if it doesn't make sense, but if it comes back to me, I really want to ask it.
Okay.
But this is your revelation that you could perhaps drill deeper, not even at a linear cost, but a cheapening cost, is so significant because of the following reason. And so could you explain the non-linearity between the deeper you go, the more wattage you can then extract from? I mean, that's the wrong way to put it, but the hotter the rock means the more energy you can produce. So can you just explain, for example, the difference between 5 kilometers and 15 kilometers societally, what it means if you can actually dig that deep and then extract the heat?
Well, maybe I should
those
first
depths.
explain why it's usually not even linear, right? And that's because the deeper you go,
Absolutely.
usually the hotter it goes, which is difficult, but it's also the harder the rock. You go deep enough, you're into the granite basement, which is really hard, difficult rock to go into. And then what also happens when you're drilling? You got these little mechanical drill bits at the front end that are being ground down, and there's a certain bit life, right? So you can imagine the harder the rock and the deeper you are, the harder the rock, the more frequently you got to change out that bit. How do you change out that bit? You have to back up the entire drill string. So if you're down 7 kilometers of drill string, imagine how long it takes to bring all that out just to change the bit and to go back down again.
Yeah.
So-
I think today, funnily enough, it's such a coincidence that I happened to be at a conference today talking about it. But they said at this site in Southampton, it took 20 hours to do that.
Right. So you don't want to do it too often. You don't want to do it once a day, or you're never going to be doing much drilling,
You
right?
never get anything done.
So that's part of the problem. And so slower rate of penetration and decreasing bit life, and you end up getting, amongst other issues. The other problem is, you get into physical limitations. Why do you usually stop off maybe at 7 kilometers? Because by that point, the drill sting is so heavy, you can't hang it off the same, rig. You can't lift it out. It's 7 kilometers of heavy steel pipe. That's a lot of weight to hoist up. And so if you want to go below 7 kilometers today, you got to have some lighter alloy. So it's, the weight of a 6 kilometer pipe instead of a 7. So all these problems are there. The other problem is, of course, as you go down, the easiest way of looking at it is what's the energy content of that brine? Traditionally it goes up a little bit, each degree it goes up. But once you get down deep enough and hot enough, you get in, past liquid, past gas, into a supercritical condition that, has a lot more energy in it than just, heating up a bunch of water a little, a degree here or a degree there. We all know about phase transitions and everything else. You're heating up water, it's, the transition from solid to liquid, from liquid to gas, where the big energy absorption or release is. And so when you go down deep, the costs go up, but, the energy content goes up as well. And so if you can reverse
generate
that,
electricity at a depth.
yeah. Well, you bring stuff up that's hot enough that you can generate electricity.
Okay, well, I have to ask you about what I think is a very exciting technology, and this is coming from someone outside of the industry, so I don't necessarily have the insight that you do, but someone trying to dig really deep, more than 15 kilometers deep, is a company out of Boston called Quaise Energy.
Yeah, I know Carlos.
So what do you think about them?
Like I say, I know Carlos. They're good guys. They're smart guys. They're working on the next generation bitless drilling, as you know, microwave technology. And, they're in a little bit different situation than us. We're trying to, we're at the high TRL level. So we're looking, how do we take these technologies and apply them right now to produce power right now? Carlos over at Quaise, their stuff's super revolutionary, but he's just working on that bit itself and will be probably for the next 10 years. And then maybe it might evolve into a commercial tool. So he's much lower down than the TRL scale, but of course aiming big time, because to drill 15 kilometers down, that would be totally revolutionary.
It solves the problem.
Yeah, and that's certainly farther than we can. We think we can, solve the problem without going down 15 kilometers, but deeper is always better if you can do it cost effectively.
Yeah.
But so they're good guys. They're serious. But what I would say is, if their system works, we're happy to use it to drill Everloops. So, all these innovations are all cost inputs for all of us, and if he wins, we all win.
Yeah. My question actually just came back to me from before. Perhaps an explanation of the isolated innovation you're talking about, or maybe not isolated, but rapid innovation in short succession, multiple innovations. Basically what you've experienced at Eavor in the last couple of years. It could be explained by this lack of connection between the academics and the commercial. Because, for example, today at this conference, I brought up Quaise. They'd never heard of it. I brought up Eavor, and they were like, oh yeah, that Canadian company. These academics who live, they're geophysicists, they live in it. And they were so passionate and excited about it. But they had essentially zero understanding of the commercial side of the business outside of Sweden. They could just talk about Klimion and Skellefteå.
Yeah, no. Again, it's not by accident that Klimion developed in Sweden and we developed in Canada. Neither country has a geothermal industry, right? And that means we're free to innovate without being dumped upon. You like the historical example. Think of Galileo. Who was the primary opponent to him? It wasn't the Pope. It was the other, astronomers, and people would watch the skies and say, that's ridiculous. And part of the problem, it wasn't really that they were necessarily closed-minded. They had some very good arguments as to why Galileo was wrong that Galileo himself couldn't answer. One of them would be, if the Earth really moved around the sun, where is the stellar parallax? Stellar parallax meaning that if you're moving that far, the closer stars would be seen to move compared to the farther stars. And there was no stellar parallax. Now, the answer turned out to be stars were infinitely farther away than anyone could even imagine, right? That was, but they had a good argument. And it's the same thing, right now. There's been, I think we're up to the 47th annual Stanford Geothermal Workshop. And they've been working on, reservoir modeling for geothermal air for years and years and years. And those guys, they know a lot of experience. They've wrestled with the issue. And something new comes up, their brain will naturally think of everything that's wrong with it.
Sure, yeah.
And it's I'm not picking on them or anything. It happens in every industry and everywhere. And there has to be that interplay between the conservative establishment and the new thing to really test the new ideas. You can't have one without the other. So I'd like to think there's a symbiotic relationship there. Even so, at the time, both parties keep cursing the other one and going like, I'm sure the guys at the Stanford Geothermal Workshop are saying, who are these clowns that ever, think they can just waltz in here? And we're going, who are these old toadies who just can never change and everything? But you got to be
bureaucrats.
We've got to be fair to all of them. Everyone's working with their own background, and every side has some good arguments. But yeah, it's a common process you see everywhere, and it's definitely happened in the geothermal side as well. They all think the future is EGS, fracking, to create a better reservoir. We think we just want to get rid of the reservoir completely and just build our big radiator. But
nice.
The history will prove. Maybe we're both right, and they both work in different circumstances. I don't know.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I am chomping at the bit to ask you this Daniel Yergin question, but we'll save that for the next time. With the final minutes we have here, you said off air that a lot of the VC money comes from Singapore, which I found very interesting. Could you explain the venture capital landscape for geothermal and a peculiar reason for why it might be coming from Singapore and maybe not the United States, where most of the wealth creation and wealth center of the world is?
It's interesting. When you do a startup, there's a whole bunch of steps, and you just have to make sure you got a funder at each step, right? So you start with the sweat equity. We can take care of that. Then you need a good angel investor to get you the next few steps. We found a few people like that in Alberta, actually. A guy named Ross McCurdy and a guy named Doug Beach. And guys like Doug Beach are an interesting character because his background was in Koch Industries, not a beacon of renewable energy. But Doug got it immediately. He was a former energy trader, so he could understand it. And he put in a very sizable investment himself. Nice. But once you get past that, you're needing tens of millions. Then you need some VC type money. We went around to a few places and only by chance ended up talking to the guys down at Vickers. I think they just, because they're a little bit like us, because they didn't have any other energy investments. They could look at what we had with an open mind and make a decision on the merits. Whereas a lot of other people were, tied up in a lot of comparisons and is it really cheaper than gas and stuff. What about solar and this didn't bother these guys. So they went in. They've been around for a couple of rounds. So Vickers Venture Partners were the ones in Singapore, and we've also got Temasek, which is a Singaporean sovereign wealth fund, also invested in us. Now, at the time, I'd like to say in hindsight, one of the reasons they did it was because we're a fantastic solution for Singapore. but
is that a fact?
Well, yeah, because how else are they going to get energy independence? They've got no natural resources. They can get a little bit of solar if they cover every rooftop and their water reservoir with solar panels, but it's like a tiny amount of their total power.
Sure.
They're reliant 95% on imported LNG, so they want to be green. But now here they are, not only being not green, but not energy independent. So if we go in and say, hey, we could drill under your very own island without taking up too much space and give you a bunch of reliable power, that's gold to them.
It must be amazing having the Sovereign Wealth Fund being a financer, because it means when, the product, you would be able to maybe skip a few lines of red tape to install in Singapore,
but they're also very good at planning and doing things rationally, and so they'll do it properly, but they'll take their time. So after Singapore, after the VC money, then we moved on to the strategic money. That's when we get the BPs and the Chevrons and the BHPs and people who could really evaluate our technology come on. But those were key investors because not only do they understand the technology and can vet it and validate it, they're also ones who can implement it. Once we've got a number of these up and running, we're 50 people. We're not going to change the world on our own, drilling our own Everloops. But if we can equip people like BP or Chevron or BHP to go out and drill a bunch of their own using our technology, that's fantastic. That's how you really scale things up.
So exciting. And also, we'll touch on this next time, but the geopolitical implication of many nations around the world being able to create energy independence is in itself, so radically transitional and...
No, absolutely. Yeah. It's a game changer.
Finally, these are two very short answers for you before you leave. Can you say how much funding you've received so far?
A little over 100 million.
And what do you say when you are pitching Eavor? What is your total addressable market?
Our total addressable market, that's a hard question to say. If you look at the heating market in Western Europe, that's almost $100 billion. If you look at the electricity market in Western US, that's also about the same size, 80 to 100 billion. The way I like to think of it is a bit different. When it comes to direct heating, I think we should be all of it, but who knows? It takes time. Who knows much it should be.
But don't be greedy, mate.
Yeah, but we when it came to the electric side, which is a more pertinent thing that can be modeled, we did a lot of work with a guy named Jesse Jenkins, who's one of our advisors down at Princeton, and he has this net zero America model where he sort of does what if scenarios on the entire U.S. energy grid, and he said, looking at the Western interconnect, given what we think our performance metrics are going to be, and assuming wind and solar continue to improve and all the other energy sources are there. The optimal design would have 20 to 40% of the grid be Everloop, which is a lot.
What is 40% of the American grid?
I don't even know how much that is power-wise, but they talked about potentially saving tens of billions of dollars a year.
Yeah.
By having that optimal.
Amazing. Can you explain the problem between where energy is generated and then where energy is consumed for renewables, and then however solves that problem?
The problem of creating energy in a different spot that you consume it isn't just for renewables, it's for traditional oil and gas as well. I mean, you look at all the oil that's been bottled up in Alberta because they don't have a pipeline out. So traditional energy sources, usually you don't want in your backyard, and usually they're close to some resource or some special asset. And then you got to get the energy from there to your house. And in between, you've got the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. So you got a pipeline or power lines between the two. And if you think it's hard to get permitting and everything sorted out for one location, try two locations with 1,000 kilometers in between where the power line is. It just multiplies where you can be attacked, where you can run into problems, where you can be held to ransom. It's a pain in the neck, and it's never very popular. Whereas if you have something that's modular, something that can be implemented in small size and scaled up to big, a power source that can go anywhere, isn't reliant on some rare resource, and actually, which is innocuous enough that you could have it in your backyard and not worry about it, all of a sudden it all becomes easy. And I guess renewables are a little bit worse than traditional energy sources, because usually traditional energy sources, you have the power plant, and then you have all the lines to the customers. In a smart grid, to balance all these intermittent supplies, you got to get a whole network, a whole matrix of lines. So when it's windy over here, you can take all the power down there, and vice versa, and mix and match. And it makes the whole thing more resilient in some case, but more complex and easier to break down in another sense. So it's a challenge. And it's expensive. Power lines are expensive. And worse than being expensive, they're slow to get approved. Decades. And who's got that time? The world's going to end in a few decades. We can't spend 20 years putting in some smart grid. Let's just put the power where we need it. Power to the people.
Yeah, the US has like a famously bad grid, don't they? Or at least a famously old grid.
It's famously old, but it's also just complex because you got so many private actors in it. It's, if you go to, let's say, Saskatchewan, it's simple. It's all run by a state monopoly. So you end up with a simpler grid, which has some disadvantages in certain senses, but a lot of advantages as well.
But with oil, right? So you make you comment on Alberta maybe having a lot of reserves that can't be pipelined down to a
right.
more densely populated area for consumption. But that oil can be barreled and then consumed directly in an engine with essentially very small energy loss in between. But the problem with renewables is that it requires a grid to then charge a battery, and there's a lot of energy lost in there. So I'm more speaking about this broader problem, the distance between renewable generation and renewable consumption, but then Eavor's solution for that as well being quite neat, that it's produced very close to the final endpoint.
Right, because we're, unlike traditional geothermal or some other, modern renewables, it doesn't have to be in a particular spot. If we end up being able to drill as deep and as hot as we'd like, we can produce the power anywhere, especially for district heating, direct heat uses. If we're generating electricity, you can transport that a bit in the traditional way. But even if you wanted to, you can't transport hot water, hundreds of kilometers. So you've got to put, if you're doing district heating, which is one of our big markets, especially in Europe, especially when people want to decarbonize and get rid of Russian gas for their heating networks, which I might add is just as big a market as electricity, then you really have to locate the energy source right below the town. And the fact that we're not reliant on any particular geology means as we develop our project, we'll eventually be able to go to any town that wants that and just drill down. And you don't need as high a temperature for a direct heat use like district heating than you do to generate electricity. So you can really do it anywhere, and you can pick the location that's best, and the location that's best is wherever it's going to be consumed. So you end up bringing source and use together in one spot, and that reduces the NIMBY problem, the local objections. It's also the most efficient. It's also the most reliant, because again, you have 1,000-kilometer power line or pipeline. That's 1,000 kilometers where something can go wrong, or something can be sabotaged, or you name it.
Mm. All right then. So bring the Eavor Tech to life and explain to the audience. Say, take Paris as an example. Mm-hmm. Very, very big city. Is it possible that Eavor could produce enough electricity through multiple different sites to power Paris through geothermal energy?
You could power Paris through geothermal energy, but that's not going to be our first stop for two reasons. One, France is one of the few countries in the world that has embraced nuclear and so has very cheap electricity. But
I should have said Berlin. Go to Germany.
Yeah, no, we're still in Paris. But what Paris does have is it does have a bunch of geothermal district heating. It's one of the few places. But what's happening, they've already tapped into all the existing aquifers. They want to do more, but they can't do more because there's no extra water down there that they're not already tapping. So we could go there and definitely make it 100% district heating from geothermal by just filling in where the traditional geothermal can't. And you mentioned Berlin. Berlin's very much the same thing, except they're currently getting all of their heating from things like exhaust from coal plants and stuff that's going to be shut down anyways, or nuclear plants. And the only alternative they have is to burn biomass or something, which isn't that green, isn't that scalable. The price of biomass has just gone through the roof because people want more of it than exists. And as we say, it's not even that green. So we're the only real solution other than nuclear that can scale, and there's lots of reasons you'd prefer us to nuclear.
I'm thinking about the promotional video on Eavor's site that highlights this tiny surface footprint of the Eavor machine that then goes underground. So how much energy would that produce? How many of those installations would it require to produce enough electricity to run Berlin, say, for example?
I don't know what the actual energy demand is in Berlin. Maybe you can look it up afterwards. But in one particular site, if it was something with a reasonable gradient, you could produce between 6 to 8 to maybe even 10 megawatts per Everloop, and you could fit 10 Everloops off one pad. So you could do 50, 60, 70 megawatts in one location, and then you'd have to move over a kilometer or so and to do another one. That's a reasonably high energy density. And most places, other than Vatican City, have enough space that you could power everything. Like I say, we've done more detailed studies in places like Singapore, for example, and are pretty sure that we could, supply all its electricity demand and all its direct heat demand from geothermal. You might not do all of it. They're going to have a couple of gigawatts of solar power out of the 10 they need, but everything else you could. And you would certainly have a very easy time of having several gigawatts that was there just to do everything essential, from running the trains to the airport to the desalination water plants to you name it. So we've got all the density we need. We just need to implement it. And again, remember, it's only the district heating that has to be on location in a particular geography. With electricity, we're more likely to go and pick a nice high temperature gradient or the closest one, within 100 miles, and then just build that out, scale it. Just have a couple of drilling rigs there that just keep drilling until you get as much energy as you need.
And that's with the tech that you currently have proven is effective?
The technology we've proven at Everlight up near Rocky Mountain House in Alberta is for sedimentary basins and more temperatures that are better for district heating, but they also can be used to produce power, as we're going to at Garrett's Reed. That'll be combined heat and power. But to be able to produce electricity in a large number of places by being able to go down deep enough and hot enough, that's what we're proving up at in New Mexico this summer.
Okay. So this is, I mean, and that's the tremendously exciting development, isn't it? You know,
that's
when you
the
can start to
shit,
produce.
Yeah, everyone
the
does
exciting
that.
shit, precisely.
District heating is a massive elephant of an opportunity, as big as the electricity one. But it's district heating. People get much more excited about it.
Like it's less sexy, even though it might have a huge market
more
potential.
Essential, more
You're not charging batteries off it.
Yeah, no, it's more essential, and that gets them off Russian gas in Europe and stuff like that. So, and it's huge opportunity. It's just not sexy. So we'll talk about drilling a well super deep. That's always more sexy.
Yeah, exactly. And they're producing enough energy to charge, you know, to turn on a TV and to charge a car and to run a train.
The whole world is being electrified. So
yeah. So then, talk about the red tape and the bureaucracy headaches that you are running up against every day that hinder your ability to iterate faster, or say, for example, in Europe, hinder your ability to install faster.
You know, to be totally honest, regulatory issues have not been the biggest factor. I mean, that's partially because when we started out, we did a global survey and we decided where we were going to go and where we were going to operate. So we picked, you know, in Europe, places like the Netherlands, places like Germany, that already had some geothermal, so they already had a regulatory regime that was up and operating. We avoided purposely places that have never had geothermal, other than Canada, because we were there. And you know, and that took a while to get in there, but the regulatory regime was not what was really holding us up. What was holding us up was just solving all the technical issues we run into over the last 5 years and had to take care of one by one. And two, like any startup, it's raising the bloody money. It takes a lot of time, because you're always in a chicken and egg thing. You know, give me some money so I can prove up this, and they'll say prove that up, and then they'll give you some money. You know, and you go around and around and around. So, you know, a lot of our time is taken up raising money, and raising money never happens just like that, right? It's even when everything goes perfectly, you know, it's like a year delay to get it all lined up, and then you get your $50 million or whatever it is you're raising. And doing a new technology, that's just hard, and that's just slow. And then once you start building it, especially now when you've got a resurgent oil price and gas price, and so the whole supply chain for casing and drill pipe and, you know, drilling rigs is all of a sudden tightened up. The other thing that takes time is just to get all the resources lined up that are on the critical path, or even building the York systems to convert the heat to electricity. That's like an 18-month window. So the real challenge for us is to get enough money so we can do enough things in parallel that we can, you know, create the massive growth path on this thing, you know, without having to do one at a time, do one and then finish that and do the other. We need to do everything in parallel, and that takes money. And that's the slowest thing. Supply chain and money. And also, you know, just getting the commercial agreements. Commercial agreements involve negotiation. So if you're negotiating a power purchase agreement or something like that, it never happens like that's, you know, in the first meeting. It's just back and forth, and it's you got to go through the negotiating dance. You know, and this works for everything. I remember when I always used to go down and buy my fake Rolex watches in Shenzen. It would take like an hour and a half negotiating back and forth to get the guy to come down to the right price. And what would drive me crazy, if I went back the next day and had to buy another one, he'd make me spend another hour and a half negotiating down. Oh no, this one's different. It's much bigger. Look, you know. And business in general is no different than that watch seller. You got to go through the dance. There's a lot of money at stake. They're big projects. There's a lot of moving parts with a lot of different partners. Yeah. So I always found all of that stuff harder than regulations. If the regulations are a problem, we got a global opportunity here. We'll just go somewhere else, then where we can build faster. I know, because everyone always, it's like anyone you ask, oh, the red tape. But I always find bigger problems elsewhere.
I'm surprised to hear that. So it sounds like it's more of just a business problem, rather than a regulatory problem. And I suppose as well in that is a lot of optimism.
Problem. It is a regulatory problem in some jurisdictions, but we've just purposely avoided those. Yeah, we got our original target list down to 14 countries I think we're going to focus on for a variety of factors. And one of them are the regulations already in place.
What are the top 3 countries?
Top 3 countries? Well, the U.S. is one of them. Germany, obviously. The Netherlands. And those are probably the 3 with the most potential, the quickest. But you got to realize, even in a place like Germany, a lot of the mining regulations and the permitting you have to get done isn't done by Germany. It's done by the states. So it's no different than the United States or Canada. It's the local province or state that does all that. And there's a huge difference between one state and the other in Germany. Some places will get the paperwork done in weeks, and the other ones will be years. This depends how well off they are, how keen they are to attract inward investment, whether they're trying to kickstart an industry that's only existing in another state. There's a big difference even within Germany from state to state.
Yeah, isn't Munich like Bavaria? That's a really friendly place for geothermal, right?
It's really pretty friendly, and they have a lot of geothermal there, including a lot of dry geothermal wells. Because they have a lot of them, I think they got a lot of permitting to do and a lot of workload, and they're not going to get too excited about yet another one. Whereas some of the other states that maybe don't have any geothermal, or maybe have less activity going on, they may be keen to get things going. And that'll be reflected not just in the speed that they do the regulations or permitting. It'll also be in the terms they offer you and the size of the lease. If it's frontier area, they'll give you a nice big lease. I think one of our leases in Germany is 750 square kilometers. That's a pretty big lease for a country like Germany.
Nice.
Sorry. It's also, I feel there's enough other people already complaining about the regulations, but a lot of it is not just to do with regulations. Some of the more difficult stuff is to do with navigating around all the various incentive schemes when you're dealing with a new technology. There's a whole bunch of, we did our Everlight demonstration well. There was 2 provincial and 2 federal agencies that all contributed money to it. So you had to go through 4 different application processes, which are always pretty damn rigorous. And then you go down to the States and you've got a whole swarm of other agencies as well.
Yeah.
Some from the Department of Energy, some from the state, some from the Department of Defense. And Europe's no different. We've been spending 2 years applying for this EU Innovation Fund, which we should know about in September. So getting, and that's a key component of cash, getting some of that non-dilutive equity is really important, because you don't want to do it all if it's a brand new technology. You don't want to do it all with expensive VC money. So these are all, I think we spend more time on the grant side with governments than we do on the talking about particular regulations. The regulations, we just get on and, get on with it. Because, a lot of those regulations, you want to be seen as good corporate partners. You gotta make sure you got the local population in the surrounding towns and villages in your favor, because it can easily go wrong. So in Bavaria, where we took too long to clear a tiny little corner of woodland, and found we were in the nesting period of the year. We had to put it off till next year. We couldn't cut the trees, so we couldn't do the earthwork. So, but that's it. You just gotta. You're not going to spend time trying to change regulations. You just live with them. If you don't like them, you move on.
So finally, John, this is a question I was teasing to you throughout our last podcast, and it's the one to do with Daniel Yergin, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning energy journalist.
Right.
And he wrote a book last year called The New Map. And in one of the final chapters titled The Changing Landscape, Disruptive Tech and the Energy Transition, he did not even mention geothermal once. Mm-hmm. Is this a really bad signal that someone whose job it is to know everything about energy didn't even consider geothermal enough to give it a mention?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one because, there's nothing. It's bad if someone badmouths you and says you're not going to succeed, but it's even worse if you're ignored. Right? But I in this case, that doesn't really bother me because, honestly, the more expertise people had in oil and gas and geothermal, the less likely they were to get onto our bandwagon. Which to me says one thing. It says what we're talking about is truly, it's simple, but it's still truly revolutionary in a certain way. And if it wasn't revolutionary, all these guys wouldn't object to it. Because, Daniel Yergin, the equivalent of Daniel Yergin in Calgary is a guy named Peter Tsakian, written several similar books with his own style. And he's a good friend of mine. And when I started this out, he didn't even want to meet with me. And it took several years. He eventually invested in it and, gets it now. But there was this too much, anyone who's an expert in oil and gas or geothermal, they've got too much previous experience that has already taught them that it's impossible. It goes against so many things that they believe. So for me, it doesn't really bother me. In fact, it's confirmation that we're onto something amazing. And it's easy for us, when we're in the middle of it, to start taking it for granted. Oh, it's a simple thing. We're just building a radiator underground. How complex can that be? But then we run into other people. We were just talking to a bunch of investment banks, some of the leading ones in the world, about leading our next financing round. And some of them also didn't get certain aspects. You had to go back over it. No, that's not what we're doing. We're doing this. And they go, oh. So because there's just too many false trails. Like we said before, it was like Galileo. It was the professional astronomers that objected to him. And they had good reasons for it, but they were ultimately wrong. So, yeah, it doesn't bother me about Daniel. He'll eventually get it.
And on the precipice of any great innovation or just development, that's why there's so much value captured by the early movers, because everyone else discounted it completely. And in fact, in that same book, Yergin's first chapter documents the shale revolution in America. And
which no one got at start either.
Yeah, and he starts it off by saying, everyone dismissed this guy as being a fool, as being a dreamer, and he was never going to make it. And I forget his name and his company, but he's the guy that innovated to...
that's quite true.
And look at the amount of value that he generated from that. So that's tremendously exciting. As someone who is interested in geothermal, I can only imagine how exciting it is for someone who is at the top of one of the most likely companies to benefit from this, transition. So,
well, we're certainly all excited about it. We sort of have to pinch ourselves every once in a while, but along these same lines, we always said, for the first couple of years of our company's existence, we had the ultimate barrier to entry. Everyone else thought we were crazy, so we didn't have to worry about anyone following us. Now we got to worry a bit more, but
sure.
We've got other barriers to entry now that are a little longer lasting.
Okay, what are they?
What are they? Well, just to start with, it's all our patent portfolio. That if you wanted to try to build an Everloop without infringing any of those patents, it'd be damn expensive and probably wouldn't work.
Okay.
And there's a whole variety of those that we have and are working on.
Mm-hmm.
But as well, there's lots of other, like anything else, there's a bunch of, to implement that technology, there's a bunch of tools and services and expertise related to it and other assets, like these 7 kilometers of insulated drill pipe we just constructed. No one else is going to have one of those, so they want to drill an Everloop. They got to first figure out how to build the insulated drill pipe, because they can't use our guys. They're all under exclusive license. They'd be breaching a patent, and they'd have to put out millions of dollars in the pipe themselves, even if they can find someone to build it. Why would they do that? Or why would they try to build one that doesn't use our rock pipe? And so they have to case the multilaterals. Doubles the price right there. Why would they do it without using our shock cooling? Where they're going to have a super expensive well and they won't be able to construct a radiator down there, et cetera, et cetera. And right down to things like, if we see land or a license area that's super appropriate for ourselves, we snap it up. It's cheap. So that's the traditional oil and gas way. That's the only way oil companies have any competitive advantage. They don't have it. They all have the same technology. Theirs is just a land grab around, a little more information. But so we got the whole world in that position. So there's a whole bunch of different elements, but mainly we make it proprietary by patenting every aspect of the system we can. So every problem we have creates a new solution, which creates some IP. And when we do the IP with everyone else, we're very generous. We let them have the IP for the rest of the world. As I said before, we just want it exclusively for our field of use, which doesn't even exist yet. We still have to prove it up. So we're very reasonable. Very, very reasonable.
And as one of the primary early movers in what could potentially be a hugely disruptive innovation, I mean, you're capturing value at 100, 10, 100, 500x discounts,
Well, we're hoping it's 100x. Certainly our VC funders hope that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what they want, but don't always get.
Question that I try to ask as many guests as possible. What is a country that you're particularly bullish on?
A country I'm particularly bullish on? Well, I'm always, a bit of a Canadian nationalist. To be honest, I've lived around the world, and given the demographic crisis a lot of places are going through, places like Japan or places like China where I lived for 13 years, I think places like Canada are one of the few countries that can actually absorb immigrants, can actually still have an open door to all the best of the best. And it's still not too crowded, and it seems to be good at assimilation. Whereas other places, they just, it's like mixing rocks in your porridge. There's no mixing, or maybe it's too volatile. You got too many guns, maybe, like some other places we know. Or you have places like China that even if they were open, where would you get 300 million immigrants, which is what you'd need to, balance the population decline. So when you look at it that way, Canada's got a pretty good spot. And also it's bloody freezing, and we got global warming, added bonus. But I gotta say, I always find good reasons to love wherever I lived. I mean, I loved living in China for 13 years. A lot of people would find that hard. There was lots of really cool, optimistic things at that time. And, I've loved living in Europe, even so each of the countries has its own difficulties. Lived in the Netherlands, lived in France, lived in the UK, done business in a whole bunch of other ones. Europe's a pretty cool place. And so lots of places I could live, but I'll give the little plug to Canada, because Canadians never build up their own country enough. But
where'd you live in the Netherlands?
In a place called Enschede, which is, I think, the 5th largest city in the Netherlands, right next to the German border. And I spent a couple of summers working there in a university called the University of 20. The joke was, where's the University of 20? Well, it's between 19 and 21. No, But no, that was a cool summer job, and I like the Netherlands. It's a pretty steady, calm place, I find.
Yeah, it's a terrific place.
And even better, it's easy to bicycle because there's no hills.
Exactly. I lived in Amsterdam for about 3 years before I moved to Stockholm. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, that's like living in London. You know, it's different than the rest of the country. Amsterdam's its own unique creation. And I didn't really know that until I lived in the center of London, then I lived way out in Sussex, 50 miles out of town, and realized, man, it's like two different universes. They didn't mix that much, except for the odd commuter like myself who would zip back and forth. You were either in the village or the city. I remember we had an old couple next to us, Doris and Norman, and they were always amazed that I went into the city every work day. And I said, well, when did you guys last go? They said, oh, I think it was the coronation. I said, that's in 1953. You haven't been back since? Oh, no, it's too noisy.
Yeah.
It's just, but you get that. It's hard to realize there's that other reality out there.
To add the triple bonus for Canada, if global warming continues at the rate that it's going, you open up this entire Arctic coastline, which will make you a trade hub. To get into Europe.
Forget about that. Just think of the beaches. The little known fact is Canada has by far the world's longest coastline. Imagine how great it would be if it wasn't frozen.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, when you think about it, where else is anywhere near as close? Could be Russia, but Russia doesn't really face
Australia?
all three seas. No, it's you think it's pretty normal, but then think of the Canadian Arctic. Think of all the islands. Think of Hudson's Bay. It's got a very circuitous coastline, which really adds. I mean, Canada's bigger than Australia already in surface area, but then when you look at the way it's the complicated coastline, it's probably double what Australia's is. I don't know that. I'm just guessing, but it's definitely bigger. And I know that fact because my grandfather used to run the Maritime Command, which is all the coast guards and lighthouses and all of it, icebreakers, all the paraphernalia.
Up the top there.
Yeah.
Well, you say that Canada needs to pump its own tires a bit, but I'll have you know that after about 80 responses, Canada is actually the most mentioned country to that question.
Oh, okay. Well, that's probably non-Canadians saying that.
No, it's not. That's true. It's Americans mostly that say it, to be honest.
Well, I know even when I used to work in England, I'd always get that. People go, like, why are you here? I want to go to Canada. Why are you here? Yeah.
You can imagine how much I get that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Why aren't you in Australia?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter where you're from. You can be from Buddha's utopia. In fact, Buddha was from Utopia. He wanted to see what the rest of the world looked like. So, finally, John.
Yeah.
A question that is my favorite. If you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, no language barrier. So if you were listening to a podcast, who would you listen to?
I was listening to a podcast. So any two people. Man. That's a tough one. But the fact is a lot of famous, it's a lot of my heroes, which would be some famous scientists and all that, they're not really great conversationalists, so I wouldn't really vote for them. I would say go for some religious figures. I'm not religious. I'm a complete atheist. But I'd still love to see a debate between, let's say, Buddha and Jesus Christ. I mean, that would be, it'd either be totally underwhelming, or you'd say, yeah, these guys really do have it together. But something like that would be interesting, or perhaps some politicians. Like if I had to do politicians, it'd be, let's say, Lincoln and Churchill, two amazing orators who really had a way with words. See how they debate the facts of the day. I'm sure that would be fascinating. So what does everyone else say?
Probably Jesus, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad.
Yeah. It's
Jesus, Pontius Pilate. Yeah, Jesus is the most common. And I like what you said about you'd want to listen to a conversationalist, someone who would actually be able to offer a decent chat. I'm not sure if there's much evidence that the religious figures would necessarily
Buddha might not actually say anything. He may just sit there contemplating the universe and navel gazing.
Yeah, change comes from within, Jesus. That would be the end of the conversation.
But even that would be interesting.
Oh, for sure. I mean, obviously, you get to essentially hear these mythical characters speak. Then for sure.
I mean, the other thing I found interesting is having visited Moscow and Beijing at the right time. I have seen Lenin. I have seen Mao Zedong. He's in a little refrigerator, but I still see him. It's sort of weird to actually see the real guy after all these years.
Yeah.
Also, they say Lenin's mostly plastic. He got a little moldy when they moved him east of the Urals to avoid the Nazis. But anyways.
Is he's still on display there, right? Or is it St. Petersburg?
I don't know. I haven't been back there since 2003 in Moscow, so I don't know if I haven't heard if he's still on display. But he's very, very small.
But yeah, the great thing about that question is that there is no consistency in it, actually. It is a reflection of the person's unique interests. Lincoln Churchill hasn't been mentioned, for example. That would be a great chat. Maybe one of the early oil barons you might get an interesting insight from him. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Just someone from a different time would be the most revealing.
100%.
It'd be the equivalent of time travel just to get their impressions of.
I think
the modern era would be boring.
The answer that stuck with me the most was two characters that I've both forgotten who they were, but it was essentially the leader of the mines and then a Spanish
Montezuma or something,
maybe, and then a Spanish monk who reflected years after the conquistadors took over Latin America on the ethics and morale of it, and for them to have a conversation to discuss the good and the bad. I mean, those sort of things would be unreal.
And one of the best books ever is The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz, who was a guy who was just a regular soldier in Cortez's army. And, you read that story, it's better than any quest fictional story you can imagine. Just the fact they arrived there, Mexico City itself was this town, 500,000 people, bigger than anything else in Europe at the time, with pyramids, having human sacrifice and mountains of gold and causeways connecting them to the shore. I mean, that must have been mind-blowing.
Oh, for sure.
That's
a great recommendation.
Yeah. Okay. I liked it. A real bestseller.
Yeah, that might be. There's a great YouTube channel called Voices of the Past, and they read out passages from first-person journal entries throughout history.
Right.
And there was a great one that looked at Mexico City, and maybe it's from that book, but it was amazing.
It could be, because he wrote it, I remember, because he got tired of all the Cortez's propaganda.
Yeah, back in the good old days when you could get away with your propaganda a lot more cleanly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
But look, John, I can't thank you enough for now giving me, I don't know, what is it, like 2 hours of your time. And
well, it was fun.
Thank you. And I think Eavor is a tremendously exciting company. So keen to see how that goes too. So thank you very much for appearing on the podcast, John. Again, very Very generous with your time. Maybe you could tell through the audio recording, if you saw on YouTube about halfway through, both of our outfits changed completely. This was actually recorded over two separate podcasts, because while we initially scheduled an hour the first time, we got almost to the end of our time and I hadn't asked him anything about geothermal. It was just all China. So he was very generous to come back and offer that second half as well. And hopefully that was enjoyable to you guys. I really liked talking to John. He had this Canadian sensibility to him, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it feels like I'm talking to an Australian almost. I think the Canadians and Australians have a very, very similar culture. But name a more exciting company than Eavor. It's absolutely unbelievable what they're doing, and all the talk in the middle about the co-evolution that John mentioned. I actually did some more research on it, and it was something that's been spoken about, batching innovation. Things like oxygen being discovered at the same time, things like the E equals MC squared occasion, the theory of relativity actually being discovered very similar times, flight being discovered at very similar times. John was right with evolution, that it was actually Wallace who both invented that theory at the same time. Calculus was invented at the same time. It's such a fascinating little insight to have. And imagine if Eavor is actually producing breakthrough after breakthrough, engineering breakthrough after engineering breakthrough, what the implications of that might be for Eavor specifically as a company in the coming geothermal revolution, if you want to call it that. But I thought that was really exciting. I thought that was really interesting. Overall, I mean, the chat was very thrilling for me. I am loving this education on geothermal energy that I am undergoing right now. And if you hadn't heard of it before, well, hopefully now it's on your radar and something that you can think about a little bit more as well. Finally, my ambition for this podcast, those who have been listening for a while have probably heard me make this plea a few times, but in case this is the first time you're ever listening, your debut show, welcome. Thank you so much for deciding to part with some of your time and listen to this podcast. What my hope is with this podcast is to corner the market for eclectic curiosities wherever it is you're looking in from. Because it should be clear to you that there is no consistent theme throughout this podcast. Basically, whatever the episode is just a combination of a reflection of my interests and the other person be willing to come on and talk about our overlapping interests. So clearly here, geothermal is of huge interest to me, as was John's extensive experience working in China. But you'll have seen as well, the last episode was checking in with my friend in Eastern Ukraine and how things are going for him. Next episode is going to be with Stephen Hicks, rounding off a 3-part series on the life and philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. The episode after that will be with Ben Burgess, talking about the life of Christopher Hitchens. But then if you just go back far enough, there's an episode on Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister assassination, all the way through to economic development, kleptocracy. Jim Henry's been on 4 or 5 times now. Basically, the show is a reflection of my own interests, and I hope that in those interests, hopefully some of them overlap with yours. Because whilst every episode might not be interesting to you, we can assume that we have some interests in common since this episode is, since you've come here for this episode. So that's my ambition for the podcast. It's to corner the market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. But the thing is podcasts have very low discoverability. So I would ask you and urge you to please leave a nice, healthy review. So if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, swipe up, give it 5 stars, and write something nice. If you're listening on Spotify, swipe up, give it 5 stars. And if you're listening anywhere else that has a review function, please be generous and leave nice, long, healthy, juicy reviews. And that's all from me. Thank you again to John, and thank you again to you, my dear listener. And that's all. Ciao.